Fierce dog storms into hospital during owner's surgery, attack surgeon. Minutes later, doctor is arrested, leaving everyone in shock. Stephen lived a simple life without luxuries, but full of love. Widowed for several years, he dedicated himself entirely to his daughter Carol and their faithful dog Max, who were his greatest reason to keep going. He did everything he could to ensure the girl never felt alone, compensating for the absence of her mother with presence and affection. All of his choices revolved around her. And even on the hardest days, he found strength to go on just by seeing her happy. Max, always by their side, seemed to understand his mission: protect the family, be there, and never let them feel helpless. Stephen's days were exhausting, marked by hard work to provide for his daughter. He faced long and heavy shifts that wore him down physically, but he never complained. To him, every effort was worth it if it meant safety for Carol. He woke up before dawn, organized everything so the girl could go to school without worries, and set off for another day of work. He came home late, often drained, but always found time to talk to his daughter and listen to how her day went. His heart belonged to her and to the dog, his two greatest treasures, the only ones who truly mattered. Max was not just a dog, he was a guardian. Since he was a puppy, he demonstrated unwavering loyalty, always alert, always ready to defend those he loved. Carol and he grew up together, inseparable, sharing both joys and sorrows. When the girl was happy, Max rejoiced with her. When she was sad, he lay next to her in silence. Stephen trusted the dog's instincts, which seemed to sense danger before anything happened. To him, Max was a gift, proof that not everything in the world was based on words. The sun had barely risen when Stephen left home for another workday. As always, he passed through the kitchen, grabbed a cup of coffee, and took one last look at his daughter, still peacefully sleeping in her room. Max, lying next to the bed, raised his head when he saw Stephen move, but quickly laid back down. Stephen sighed, adjusted his coat, and left. His day would be long, like every other, but he was used to it. At work, the routine was always intense. Noisy machines, hurried co-workers, dust filling the air. He didn't have time for distractions. Every second counted. Every movement had to be precise. He had been operating those machines for years, knew exactly how to handle them. But that morning, something felt different. "Hey, Stephen, can you help me with this part?" called one of the co-workers, pointing to a gear that seemed stuck. "Sure," he replied, wiping his hands on his coveralls and walking over. The machine he was working on was running, operating at a steady pace. He bent down, checked the fitting, and tried to free the stuck part. Everything seemed under control until a loud snap echoed through the workshop. "Wait, something's wrong," said another worker, furrowing his brow. But it was too fast. Before Stephen could react, a deafening noise filled the air. The machine jolted unexpectedly, and one of its metal arms swung with tremendous force. Stephen barely had time to turn his face before feeling the brutal impact against his body. The shock hurled him backward with force. His body hit the ground, and a cry of pain escaped his lips. Everything around him became a blur. Voices rose, hurried footsteps approached, hands tried to hold him. The world spun. The pain throbbed in his chest, making it hard to breathe. "Call an ambulance, quick!" shouted one of the workers, running to get help. "Stephen, hang in there, man. Help's on the way." Another co-worker held his head, trying to keep him awake. Stephen's vision flickered between darkness and bright flashes of light. He tasted blood in his mouth. His body felt heavy, and each breath was a huge effort. He tried to speak, but all that came out was a muffled groan. Minutes seemed like an eternity until the distant sound of a siren filled the air. Paramedics arrived in a rush, pushing the workers away. "He's got a serious chest injury. We need to get him out now," said one of the paramedics, checking his vitals. Stephen barely felt them lift him. His body no longer responded, and his mind began to surrender to unconsciousness. The noise around him grew more distant, like he was sinking into a deep sea. Meanwhile, back at Stephen's house, the phone rang insistently, cutting through the silence. Carol was in the living room, finishing getting ready to leave. The persistent ring made her stomach churn. Something was wrong. Her dad never called at this time. She grabbed the phone from the table and answered, feeling an odd pressure in her chest. "Hello? Carol, it's Rebecca." The voice on the other end sounded hesitant, a bit out of breath, as if she were trying to find the right words. "Rebecca, what's wrong?" she asked immediately, her heart beginning to race. "There was an accident at your dad's work." The world around her seemed to blur. "What?" Her voice came out faint, almost breathless. "It was a machine. A technical issue. Stephen was hit. They're taking him to the hospital now. It's serious." Carol's breath faltered. No, this can't be happening," she whispered, pressing her forehead with her hand. "I know it's a shock, sweetheart, but you need to come now. He's going into surgery as soon as he arrives. I'm going there too, but you need to hurry." Carol didn't respond. She hung up the phone and stood up so abruptly she nearly stumbled. The air felt heavy, and a suffocating tightness gripped her chest. "Dad!" she whispered, feeling panic spread through her body. Before she could take another step toward the door, Max stepped into her path. He was growling softly, his ears alert, his eyes fixed on her with an almost human expression of concern. "Max! Move out of the way," she demanded, trying to sidestep him. The dog moved to the side but continued blocking her path. His barking started short and insistent, as if he were trying to speak to her. "I don't have time for this!" she shouted, pushing him lightly. But Max didn't budge. He growled more forcefully, moving wherever she tried to pass, sniffing the air as if something bothered him. Carol tried to rush toward the door, but the dog advanced ahead, barking loudly, desperate. She stopped, took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. She looked at Max and saw that his fur was completely raised. He knew. He felt what was happening. Okay, you're coming with me," she said, opening the door wide. As soon as the words left her mouth, Max bolted outside, running down the stairs before she could catch up to him. Within minutes, they arrived at the hospital. It was chaos. The sound of hurried footsteps, voices cutting the air, the distant beep of heart monitors, and the sharp smell of disinfectant filled the space. Carol rushed in, her chest exploding with desperation. Her eyes scanned the reception, looking for any familiar face. Max, by her side, walked restlessly, sniffing everything around as if trying to track down Stephen. As soon as she entered the lobby, a nurse approached with a stern expression. "Ma'am, animals aren't allowed inside," she said, pointing to Max. Carol looked at the dog, who remained by her side, growling softly, his breath quickened. She felt a knot in her throat. She couldn't send him away. He needed to be with her. He's my emotional support dog," she said quickly, trying to sound firm. "I can't be without him." The nurse furrowed her brow, evaluating her for a few seconds. She looked at the dog and then at the desperation in the young woman's eyes. "All right, but keep him under control," she said before walking away. Carol sighed heavily. She didn't know if it would last long, but at least for now, Max would stay with her. "Carol!" She turned at the sound of her name. Rebecca was there in the reception with a grim expression. "Rebecca, where is he?" she asked, already feeling tears threaten to fall. "He arrived a few minutes ago. The medical team took him straight to surgery." Did he really need surgery? Carol felt her legs give out, a tremor overtaking her body. "He was badly injured, Carol. The doctors said they couldn't wait." She shook her head, trying to process the words, but the world seemed to spin. She breathed deeply, but it felt like the air wasn't reaching her lungs. I need to see him." "Not right now, sweetheart." Rebecca put her hands on her shoulders. They're still operating. Carol ran her hands over her face, trying to hold back tears, but the anguish was too much. She sat on the nearest bench, burying her face in her hands, while Max beside her wouldn't sit still. The dog growled softly, his eyes fixed on the door that led to the operating room. His tail was stiff, his paws dragging on the floor impatiently. He sensed that something was wrong, and his restlessness only heightened Carol's distress. She looked up, seeing the dog's alert expression. "It'll be okay," she whispered, but even she didn't believe it. Over the next minutes, the waiting room remained engulfed in suffocating silence, interrupted only by the occasional sound of hurried steps from doctors and nurses. Carol stayed seated, her hands tightly clasped in her lap, her head lowered, trying to contain the whirlwind of thoughts that tormented her. Max, however, did not share her stillness. The dog kept moving around, growling softly, his eyes fixed on the door where Stephen had been taken. She tried to ignore the dog's behavior, telling herself it was just nervousness. But deep down, she felt a tightness in her chest. Max never acted without reason. "Stay still, Max," she murmured, stroking his bristling fur. But he didn't calm down. On the contrary, his barks grew louder, more intense. He pulled at the leash, looking directly at the door to the surgical wing. "Carol, he seems really agitated," Rebecca remarked, frowning. "I know, but I don't know what to do," she said, trying to hold on to the dog more firmly. "I've never seen him like this." Suddenly, as if something had struck him, Max yanked forcefully, nearly pulling the leash from Carol's hand. He let out a loud bark, and before she could react, broke free completely and bolted down the corridor. "Max, no!" she shouted, standing up suddenly. Nurses tried to block him, but the dog was too fast. He leapt over chairs, dodged stretchers, and weaved past outstretched hands trying to catch him. "Get that dog!" one of the receptionists screamed, alarmed. "He's heading for the operating room," a nurse yelled. Carol ran after him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could barely keep up with Max's speed as he charged through the halls, as if he knew exactly where he needed to go. "Max!" But the dog didn't stop. In a swift move, he shoved a side door open with his snout, and before anyone could stop him, dashed into the operating room. The sterile environment of the surgical suite was thrown into chaos. Doctors and nurses froze when they saw the dog enter, growling fiercely. The shiny equipment gleamed under the cold light. The constant beep of heart monitors filled the space. Stephen lay unconscious on the operating table while the medical team surrounded him. The head surgeon, a tall man in a spotless white coat, took a step back, surprised by the unexpected intrusion. "What the hell is this dog doing here?" he asked, his voice heavy with irritation. Before anyone could respond, Max lunged forward. The dog jumped directly at the doctor, his teeth tearing through the sleeve of his coat. The sound of the fabric ripping echoed through the room, followed by a startled scream from the assistants. Surgical instruments fell to the ground with a loud metallic clatter. "Get this animal out of here!" screamed one of the nurses, stepping back in fear. The surgeon stumbled backward, his eyes wide with shock and fear. Max growled with intensity, showing his teeth, his posture completely aggressive. It was like he was facing a mortal enemy. "My God, get him out of here!" yelled one of the assistants. Nurses rushed to try to restrain the dog, but he dodged, leaping in different directions, keeping his eyes locked on the surgeon. It was clear that the target was that man. The doctor, sweating profusely, looked around desperately. "This is insane! This dog is dangerous!" he exclaimed, taking another step back. At that moment, the door slammed open violently. "Max!" Carol entered, her eyes wide as she took in the scene before her. Her heart nearly stopped when she realized the chaos unfolding. Max continued to growl, ready to strike again. She ran to him, kneeling by the dog and grabbing him by the neck. "Calm down, boy. It's me. It's okay." Max was breathing heavily, his body tense, eyes fixed on the surgeon. But upon hearing Carol's voice, His stance softened a little. He still growled but began to pull back. Security guards arrived just then, rushing toward the animal. "We need to take him out right now," one of them announced. "Don't hurt him," Carol protested, holding Max firmly. He's just scared." "This dog is a threat to everyone here," the surgeon shouted angrily. But there was something strange in his eyes. Carol noticed it. There was something beyond the anger. It was fear. Max remained tense, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He still didn't take his eyes off the surgeon, as though sensing something no one else there could. The room fell into absolute silence, everyone watching the scene with apprehension. And then the guards finally subdued Max. Carol couldn't have known, but at that moment, her dog had just prevented something much bigger. Something terrible was about to be revealed. The chaos in the operating room seemed to cease. Max was still panting, his eyes fixed on the surgeon, as if his mission had not yet been completed. The guards held him firmly, but Carol positioned herself between them and the dog, her heart still pounding. "He needs to leave," one of the guards said firmly. "No, I've already explained he's my emotional support dog." Carol spoke quickly, her breath short. "Ma'am, he interrupted a surgery and attacked a doctor." The other guard replied, narrowing his eyes. I know, but please, I need him with me. He's calmed down now, he won't do anything." Carol looked at Max, who was now lowering his head, panting but alert. He just sensed something was wrong. "Please let him stay." The guards exchanged looks, pondering. The tallest one crossed his arms and sighed. "If he causes any more trouble, we'll take him out immediately," he said reluctantly. "I promise he won't." Carol nodded quickly, pulling Max closer. The guard stepped back, but remained alert. Carol breathed deeply and took the dog back to the waiting room. Her body still trembled, the adrenaline making her heart race. She sat heavily in one of the chairs, feeling her legs give way. Max lay down beside her, panting, but his eyes never left the door to the operating room. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to absorb everything that had happened. But before she could process her own thoughts, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. Carol opened her eyes and saw a group of police officers entering the hospital. The waiting room went dead silent. The officers walked with purpose, their faces serious, their uniforms immaculate, guns holstered, and badges shining under the cold hospital lights. Everyone around her exchanged glances, murmuring in low tones. The guard near her frowned. Did someone call the police? Carol just watched, her stomach twisting with anxiety. The officers didn't hesitate. They moved directly to the operating room. The door opened, and moments later the surgeon Max had appeared, adjusting his torn coat, still breathing irregularly. He stopped when he saw the officers, his expression shifting to something Carol couldn't identify. "Dr. Jones," one of the officers said formally. The surgeon blinked a few times, looking confused. "It's me. What's going on here? You're under arrest for suspected medical negligence, surgical incompetence, and involvement in a series of suspicious medical complications." The lead officer raised a piece of paper. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The entire hospital seemed to freeze. "What?" The doctor's eyes widened, his posture stiffened. "This is a mistake. We've received new reports and solid evidence in the last few hours, and there's enough time to ensure your detainment," the officer continued. "Please cooperate and extend your hands." The heavy silence was broken by the cold click of handcuffs. The doctor stood frozen for a moment. His breathing grew irregular, his eyes darting rapidly from side to side, as if searching for an escape. But he didn't resist. With a heavy sigh, he raised his wrists, allowing the officer to cuff him. Whispers grew among the nurses and staff. "My God," one of the nurses murmured. "Is this serious?" another asked in shock. Carol watched the scene, her chest rising and falling quickly. Her eyes went to Max, who was now completely still. The dog just watched the handcuffed doctor, his posture finally relaxing. And it was then that Carol understood. Max knew. He had always known. As the surgeon was escorted out, Carol remained seated, still trying to process what had just happened. Minutes passed, and a new doctor appeared in the hallway, walking briskly toward the operating room. He wore an immaculate coat and had a serious, focused expression. "I'll take over Mr. Stevens' surgery," he declared. Carol looked at Max and realized that, for the first time since they arrived at the hospital, he had stopped growling. He was simply watching the new doctor and then calmly lay down next to Carol's chair, letting out a heavy sigh. She swallowed hard, feeling the tears well up in her eyes. "You knew all along, didn't you?" she whispered, running her hand through Max's fur. The dog just closed his eyes for a moment, as if finally at peace. Hours later, Carol sat next to Stephen's bed, holding his hand gently. The hospital room was quiet, illuminated only by the soft light coming from the hallway. The constant beep of the heart monitors echoed softly, a sound that now felt reassuring. He was alive. He was okay. Max, lying next to the bed, kept his head raised, watching every move of his owner with attentive eyes. Since they allowed the dog to enter, he hadn't left his side for a second. He seemed to understand that his mission wasn't fully completed. Carol wasn't sure how much time had passed, but when she felt a gentle pressure on her hand, her heart raced. Slowly, Stephen's eyes began to open. At first, they were cloudy, as if his mind was still adjusting to reality. He blinked a few times, furrowing his brow, until finally his gaze met Carol's. "Carol." His voice was hoarse, weak, but full of relief. She smiled, feeling tears burn in her eyes once again. "Dad." Her voice faltered for a moment. "You're okay." He blinked a few times, trying to remember where he was. He slowly moved his fingers, feeling his daughter's touch. His gaze then wandered around the room until it landed on Max, still by the bed, watching him closely. What happened?" His voice was still hesitant, and Carol realized he had no idea what events had brought him there. She took a deep breath, running her hand over her face, trying to decide where to begin. How could she explain that if it hadn't been for Max's unwavering instinct, maybe his fate would have been different? "It was an accident at work, Dad. You were hit by a machine, and they had to perform emergency surgery." He furrowed his brow, trying to remember, but seemed too exhausted to piece everything together. "The doctor?" His voice was almost a whisper. Carol swallowed hard. "That's what I was going to tell you." She quickly glanced at Max before continuing. "Something was wrong, Dad. Max, he felt it. He knew something wasn't right." Stephen narrowed his eyes, confused. "The doctor who was going to operate on you was arrested, Dad. He had been under investigation for a long time for surgical errors, negligence, and worse. If Max hadn't done what he did, if he hadn't invaded that surgery, maybe you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Her silence stretched for a few seconds. Stephen blinked slowly, absorbing every word. He looked at the dog, who now raised his head and wagged his tail lightly, as if awaiting a response. "So, Max saved me," he said, his voice almost incredulous. Carol smiled, wiping away a single tear that had slipped down her face. He didn't hesitate for a second. Stephen slowly reached out and gently petted the dog's head. Max closed his eyes for a moment, as if finally satisfied. In the following days, the story spread. Stephen's name appeared in local newspapers, but what grabbed the most attention was the unusual scene of a dog interrupting a surgery. Headlines like "Dog Interrupts Operation and Leads to Surgeon's Arrest" and "Four-Legged Hero Prevents Tragedy" began circulating on all the networks. Carol and Stephen watched the reports on TV, still trying to believe it had all really happened. "This is everywhere," Stephen commented, holding a cup of coffee while staring at the screen. Carol shook her head, laughing. "I know. Everyone wants to know more about the dog who saved his owner." Adil. Max, who was lying at the foot of the bed, perked up at the sound of his name, but soon went back to resting. Over time, life returned to normal. Stephen's recovery was slow, but he was grateful to be alive. He knew every additional day with his daughter, and Max was a gift. Many at the hospital still talked about what happened that night. Some saw Max as an aggressive animal, a threat. But to Carol and Stephen, he would always be much more than that. He was a guardian, and that day he proved that true love doesn't need words. He protected those who mattered most to him, without hesitation, without fear, only with the pure and unwavering instinct of someone who would do anything to keep his family safe. After all, some stories don't need to be explained. They simply happen to remind us of what truly matters. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. See you in the next story.